Australia has the very unfortunate honour of having some of the most unaffordable housing in the entire world. Sydney's median house price is now 1.6 million and the median rent now in Sydney is over $1,000 a week. That's $52,000 a year for a Sydney dog box. So the question has to be asked, how did we bloody well get here? What decisions put the Australian housing market on this current path to destruction? And who's to blame? I'm Biko Konstantinos, and that's what we're going to talk about today. I've got one question to ask.
Do you want to build a snowman?
Do you want to build a snowman? And like this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't. Because if you do, you might just get some great independent analysis and commentary from yours truly. And we can still have a great life building snowmans and living in affordable housing until the evil overlords try and take control of the entire planet, make housing become so affordable that you're basically a slave, and then use your desperation to get total control over every aspect of your life. I wonder what made me think of that. Someone once said that reality can be stranger than fiction. Now who's to blame for setting up the Australian housing market to fail? To answer this question, we're going to have a look at this article titled "The Men and Decisions Behind Australia's Housing Crisis," written by Mike Secombe for the Saturday paper. According to the article, nothing highlights the start of all the destruction more than a radio interview that John Howard, then Prime Minister, had in 2003. At this stage, the coalition government had been in power since 1996, and basically from then until 2003, house prices had doubled. So the interviewer wanted to know what John Howard planned to do about the drastic rise in house prices. He would soon find out absolutely, unequivocally, bloody nothing. I haven't found anybody in 7.5 years shake their fist at me and say, "Howard, I'm angry with you for letting the value of my house increase," was John Howard's famous response. But the interviewer said that they could be the first to complain because the boom in house prices could mean that they could be forced to rent forever. And when Howard found out that they didn't own their own home but were rather renting, he said sorry, he was talking about people who owned their own home. Howard couldn't have been more dismissive of people who didn't own their own home and faced the possibility of being locked out of housing. And also, it was clear as bloody day that Howard's view was that a house was not a home but rather an investment. And ever since that day, those two broad destructive philosophies have continued. If you don't own a home, sorry, we just don't care about you. And all our policies are basically there to support property owners. And that's because property ownership is one of the best ways to create wealth. And boy, hasn't that become the mantra of Australia. Why do anything productive to support the economy when you can buy existing property and generate easy wealth? It's a no bloody brainer. And Howard seemed to love the idea because the increased wealth that property owners get from rising prices make them feel way richer, which means they spend more and take on more debt, which keeps the economy growing. But to me, it's sort of like a fake and very unproductive type of a growth. A bit like a pimple full of pus. Yes, it might grow, but it's disgusting and will end up exploding with blood and pus. Sorry for the visual. But hey, that's our housing market. Before Howard came into power, house prices and average wages had actually been rising in parallel for a number of decades. And you can see that clearly reflected here, with wages in dark red rising very similar to house prices in the orange through the 70s, 80s, and most of the 90s. But 1996 around here is when the Howard coalition government got into power, and check out what house prices have done compared to the average full-time earnings. And since COVID, the gap between house price rises and wage rises has widened catastrophically and become more like a chasm. Between 2001 and 2022, house prices grew more than 400%, and during that period, wages grew nowhere near that amount. And like a steam train cranking at full throttle, nothing has been able to stop Australian house prices from thundering upwards. Now, what's the overall effect of this Australian fixation on building wealth from housing? Well, it basically leads to a much lower quality of life for future generations. Back in 2022, the average retirement age was 55, and only 4% of homeowners aged 65 carried any mortgage debt. So just over 20 years ago, the vast majority of Australians owned homes and they were fully paid off in their retirement. But now the average retirement age is around 65, 10 years longer, and a whopping 50% of homeowners aged 55 to 64 still have mortgage debt. And that figure will keep increasing because new buyers have to get larger mortgages and service them over longer periods. Basically, future generations will have a mortgage till they die. And ain't that an exciting prospect? For the privilege of affording a dog box 40 kilometers from the city, you get to be in debt for life. Thanks, Australia. Now, negative gearing was already in place in Australia when Howard took office, so we can't blame him for that. But when questioned about it, he said he'd never wind it back because the result would be rents through the roof. And that same mantra has now continued for over 20 years. But according to veteran economist Saul Eslake, it's a big fat lie. Now, Paul Keating as Treasurer tried to abolish negative gearing in 1985, stating that it was a giant rort, only to reinstate it in 1987 following sharp rises in rents in Sydney and Perth. But Eslake and others point out that these rent rises were a consequence of shortage of supply. During that same period, in Brisbane and Adelaide, rents actually fell, and in every other city saw no impact. So Labor buckled in the face of a massive scare campaign from the opposition, vested property interests and the media. And now negative gearing remains many years later, and it's one of the chief property investment strategies employed by high-income earners in Australia. In 1999, on advice from one of Howard's friends, the government halved the rate of capital gains tax payable when properties were sold. Now, the combination of negative gearing, which was already in place, combined with the halving of capital gains tax, created massive speculative demand for property in Australia, which has snowballed since then as the tax-effective wealth generated by property owners causes everyone else want to also get onto that gravy train. So when you just had negative gearing, you were able to sort of defer paying some of your tax by reducing your income, because when you finally sold the property, then you had to pay the full capital gains tax. But when the capital gains tax discount came in, you not only reduced your taxable income due to negative gearing, you also paid far less tax when you eventually sold the property. It's like a double banger benefit for property owners. And by understanding this, you can see why the wealth gap between property owners and non-property owners keeps widening and widening. So Australians were promised that halving the capital gains tax would result in a more dynamic economy, more investment, including in building more homes, which would actually improve housing affordability. And the brainchild behind the policy, John Ralph, said it would turn Australia into a nation of shareholders and entrepreneurs. But instead, it's turned us into a nation of landlords and property speculators. I mean, why be an entrepreneur, take on all that risk when you can make guaranteed tax-effective gains through property? It's a no freaking brainer. When you treat housing as an investment over a safe and secure place for someone to live, you plant seeds of destruction which will eventually destroy entire society. Maintaining negative gearing as well as capital gains tax discount ends up costing the government billions in lost revenue, but also it overwhelmingly benefits those who are already rich. Recent Treasury forecasts expect foregone revenue due to rental property deductions or negative gearing to total $27 billion, and the vast majority of those benefits flow to wealthier Australians. And that's just investing in Australia 101. If you're on a high income, buy an expensive property that's losing money, claim negative gearing so you can reduce your taxable income, and in 10 or 20 years that property will be worth a fortune. But when we look at capital gains tax discount, the tax benefits are even more skewed towards the rich, with estimates forecasting foregone revenue of $19 billion and 80% of those deductions going to the top 10% of highest income earners. Now, Labor did try to reduce the speculative element in the Australian housing market by proposing to reduce the capital gains tax discount from 50% to 25% and ending negative gearing for existing homes. They said this would save $32 billion over a decade, and by only allowing negative gearing for new builds, should increase overall housing stock, make homes more affordable, and generate construction industry jobs. Now, those policies seem extremely sensible to me. You reduce the benefits for those just trying to speculate on existing property, whilst encouraging investment in new supply of housing. But what happened? Massive scare campaigns, Labor lost 2 elections, and now the Labor Albanese government wants nothing to do with that sensible housing taxation reform. Now, Albanese knows this is sensible policy, as you can see by this video from 2016.
The fact is that our policy out there dealing with the issue of housing affordability is critical, and I find that it's been particularly well received in my electorate, where people in Sydney know that house prices are freezing people out of the market, and that if someone goes to an auction, they don't want to be competing with investors. They actually want to own their own home.
Not only is Albanese not willing to look at any real housing reform, he's actually made the housing crisis so much worse by running a mass immigration program. As we've seen, Australia already had one of the most speculative housing markets in the entire world. When you combine that with mass immigration, so you've got record numbers of people fighting over houses to buy and houses to rent, you end up with an overheated, illogical, and unfair housing market where the haves see their wealth rise exponentially while the have-nots get pushed further and further towards poverty. Howard brought in the capital gains tax discount in 1999, and that combined with negative gearing turned the Australian housing market into a speculative play toy that benefits those who are already wealthy. Yes, there are a multitude of other factors that have contributed to this disaster. However, not giving a rat's ass to those Australians who don't own property, whilst making sure that property owners get the benefit of ultra generous tax deductions, is a sure way to create wealth inequality, housing insecurity, and overall societal breakdown. I'm Biko Konstantinos.